For everyone who is here, I'm Lisa Bender. I represent Ward 10 on the Minneapolis City Council, and I serve as the president of the City Council. I have to leave in a minute to attend a budget meeting with the mayor and other council members, but I did want to just offer some brief remarks before turning it over to my colleagues, who are the other authors of today's action. So today, the City Council unanimously voted to advance a proposed ballot measure that would ask Minneapolis voters to amend the city charter to create a new Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention and to remove the police department as a charter department. Together, we are united in making Minneapolis a safe place for every single resident and visitor in our city. And we are united across the city in our commitment to make real change. We have the responsibility as a council with our community to work toward the structural solutions that match the scope of the problem and with the urgency that this moment demands. So each of my colleagues will speak more to this moment, to how we got here and where we are headed. And I will turn it over to Councilmember Gordon, I believe, next, and with my thanks to my colleagues for all their work.
Thank you very much. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got to this position. I think I was selected to do this because I've been on the council a long time. I first was elected in 2005 and started serving in 2006. And I will say during that campaign, police accountability was a big issue. And I came into office looking for ways I could make improvements. It probably took about a month or two when I was serving on the Public Safety Committee until I heard from our deputy city attorney, who explained to me that even when the council gives a staff direction to the police department, it's really a request because of the charter and the way it was established. We then went on to try to change city policy. I remember one of the first things we worked on was a task force to improve civilian review authority, and one of our biggest recommendations was to develop an early warning system. Another recommendation that came from the bully pulpit that we had from that task force, but again, it didn't have the strength to actually get it done. Later, we looked at the use of force policy and tried to push changes there, but that policy wasn't set by the council, I learned, and isn't set by the council. That's set by the police department, which is separate. One of the biggest stories that I remember about this had to do with tasers, when the department wanted $250,000 so that they could buy tasers. Well, we were able to use the budget to hold back those sources until a policy was developed and put in place that was worked on with community and community meetings, and it was a pretty sound and solid policy that the police agreed to implement. And they did, and they got the money and they bought the tasers, but 6 months later that policy disappeared from the police department's website and was gone and changed, and it was clear that that policy wasn't city policy, that was department policy that they were setting. So discussions about how we could look at the charter and change the charter have gone on a long time. People will probably recall that it came up in 2018 when there was a suggestion to amend the charter then so that we could look at it. For years, people have pointed to the charter as a reason why we couldn't do more to make systemic change. And I think we have a great opportunity where we can actually look at it, and we have a proposal before us that will create the framework and the structure that we need so that we can go about the transformational work that we want to do in the next year, and then fill in the details and modify our ordinances as we're ready so that we can really have a new kind of way of doing public safety so that all people can be safe in our city. And I think I'll let Councilmember Fletcher take it next so he can help us guide us through the rest of our press conference.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Next up is Councilmember Ellison.
I want to thank my colleagues, Gordon and Fletcher. I wanted to say that I'll keep my comments short, that there are three major barriers that we can see, and I talked about this a little bit during the council meeting. But the state legislature is a barrier to transformative public safety. The Police Federation is presenting themselves as a barrier to transformative public safety, and the charter has long been a barrier, as Councilmember Gordon just so succinctly described, to transformative public safety. Of those three things, the charter is the thing that we have some say over. We've been in our own way in a lot of ways. I think that because of how the police are written into the charter, there has been a lack of accountability. There's been a lack of an ability for council members who are elected by the people to affect the plans and actions of the police department. And so we think that it's appropriate for us to examine how we've done policing before. We think that largely it has been a failure. These small reforms have been a failure, and this is the clear path forward. Whereas those other two paths have proven to be in utter gridlock and pretty immovable. I think aside from that, this ultimately is on a trajectory to go to voters, and so the public, almost every single person in the city of Minneapolis, will have their opportunity to say, do I like the status quo, or do I think that we can do public safety better? That will be the real question, and the public will be absolutely a part of that discussion and ultimately make the final decision. I'll end there and wait for questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison. I'll make a few brief remarks before kicking it to a couple more of my colleagues. And I just want to say that our community is really demanding urgent change in our approach to public safety right now, and the Minneapolis City Council is ready to act. While none of us could have predicted the events of the last month, many of us have been laying the groundwork for a shift in our approach for years. That means that even while we begin a year of community engagement, there are already research-based programs and strategies that have been publicly vetted and can be acted on now. In 2018, the Minneapolis City Council created the Office of Violence Prevention in the Department of Public Health and reallocated $1.1 million from a proposed MPD increase to give it its initial funding. That office, on that meager budget, has built programs and public-private partnerships to deploy a public health approach to group violence, at-risk youth, and more. As a result of that work, we have the opportunity to invest in programs that are proven, already operational, and can be expanded. This council has expanded the funding for mental health co-responders and increased the percentage of mental health calls that we can respond to. We can continue to lean into that work. In 2019, the City of Minneapolis convened a 911 working group composed of city staff and community members publicly appointed by the City Council, which has done a groundbreaking deep dive analysis into how we respond to 911 calls, what types of calls we receive and what volume, and where there are opportunities to respond better and produce better outcomes with non-police responses. Their initial report came through too late to be implemented in last year's budget, but it has always been this council's intention to act on these thoughtful and data-driven suggestions. This work resonates with work in progress at Hennepin County, spearheaded by Commissioner Irene Fernando, to improve 911's agility to enact more nuanced dispatch. We'll also continue to leverage and support community partnerships to produce solutions. I've been lucky to be part of a downtown safety collaborative that includes a range of partners from the DID to YouthLink to the Hennepin Theater Trust and many, many more. We've been field testing approaches, including new resources for youth outreach, DID ambassadors at late night, de-escalatory work from Mad Dads and other partners, and more to create a multi-layered approach to respond to the ways that downtown has not always felt or been safe. That work and similar partnerships in communities all over the city also provides evidence-based tested programs that can expand and adapt to our safety needs. In short, the Minneapolis City Council has generated programs, partnerships, and plans that we can build on now, even as we engage in the big picture conversation about public safety. With that, I want to turn over to Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. I've been hearing a lot of suggestions from many constituents with their ideas of how we can transform the face of public safety. And the truth is that these changes are just not possible under the current city charter. Today, we make the necessary step in the process to make the changes I'm hearing my constituents want to see. Thanks, and I'll turn it back over to Councilmember Fletcher.
Councilmember Cunningham will speak next.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison. So I'll just start off with saying that today was the first step in a long process, but it's a critical step in the right direction. Changing the city charter will remove barriers that can get in the way of us as elected officials, making sure that the best solutions brought forward by our community can be brought to life. We need to keep moving forward in this effort to get this effort on the ballot, and I hope voters will vote yes so that we can keep doing this work together. During the last City Council meeting, we passed a resolution creating a future of community safety work group. As the council member leading this aspect of the process, I am so grateful to the city staff who are bringing their creativity, brilliance, and years of experience and expertise to the table, as well as our phenomenal national partners as we operationalize a plan, including a deep community engagement process to get us to a place of having systems of public safety that are rooted in the public health approach and keep all of our residents safe. As the city and residents of Minneapolis, we have to understand that violence is a disease that spreads. This means that it can also be prevented and treated. This idea is not new in the United States or the world or even Minneapolis. So we are not inventing the wheel or starting from scratch when we say that we are reimagining public safety for our city. When we look forward to our collective vision for community safety and violence prevention, we have lessons and concrete examples to build on from other cities, ranging from Camden to Vail, Colorado, which has a program where mental health experts are responding to mental health crises, Chicago and Baltimore that have community-based organizations that are disrupting and interrupting violence as it unfolds, as well as New York City and other solutions that we have here in Minneapolis that we can bring to scale. We have a multitude of amazing community-led groups who are out in the community and on the front lines of community violence every single day. And it is our responsibility as the city to support their efforts and be able to support the talent and skills that they uniquely bring to the table. The work ahead of us centers on one outcome, and that's to keep every single resident safe in a community-oriented and just way, and ensure anytime a resident calls 911, they get the exact kind of help they need. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. Before we turn to questions, we'll hear from Public Safety and Emergency Management Committee Chair, Councilmember Kano.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. I think I accidentally turned off my camera, even though I meant to turn it on. So today is a pretty historic day, having 12 council members approve the language before us to send it to the Charter Commission for their input. And so I want to remind us that 2 weeks ago, roughly, 9 of us council members stood together on the stage of a public park in South Minneapolis to talk about our commitment and our agreement on the fact that we don't believe our current policing system can be reformed. I think many of us clearly saw that as a reality when the murder of Mr. George Floyd was documented by residents and became a national call to action for a new way to do safety in our communities. And we also pledged to start the process to end our current policing system. And I think that today's actions are us clearly demonstrating that that process has begun, and that we are moving forward united in creating a new system that cultivates public safety. And the questions we have to propose before voters are really about ensuring that Minneapolis residents can choose their own future on policing and safety. And so I want to encourage all of us to remember the thousands of people that have come out to the streets time and time again, whether it was the losing of Mr. Jamar Clark's life, the losing of Mr. Young Fong Lee, the losing of the life of Justine Damon, and now George Floyd. All of those voices and many, many residents have engaged us time and time again over years, asking us to make sure these systems work for our community. And the charter questions that we have brought forward to the Charter Commission now, and hopefully to the voters by November 3rd, are about that freedom, the freedom to choose the future of our city and how we're going to be able to provide help for one another and how we're going to be able to protect one another. And so I believe that these steps that we have taken today, again, in unison, I think that's unprecedented in the history of Minneapolis, that we've been able to take this step together to make sure that our city, who is in so much pain and who feels so divided, can look to us in a united voice to say, we are here committed to build this new system with you and for you. And it's long overdue, like some of my colleagues have already mentioned. So I'm really looking forward to engaging with all of our residents and our Charter Commission members into this path of creating a new safety system that helps to protect our community members and to put us on a path to create a system that will be consented to and built by everyone that is a part of Minneapolis.
Thank you, Councilmember Cano, and thank you to all of my colleagues. We'll turn now to questions. I have a few members of the press who have signed up to ask questions, and colleagues, if you would like to respond to a question that comes to all of us, please put your name in the chat, just as we do during council meetings. We'll start off calling on Liz Navratil from the Star Tribune. Liz. You may have to hit *6 to unmute yourself.
Wonderful. It was just a couple weeks ago in Powderhorn Park that you guys were talking about ending the MPD, and this does still leave open the possibility of having licensed officers. What changed or evolved in those couple of weeks?
Councilmember Ellison.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for the question. I don't think anything changed or evolved in the last couple of weeks. I think that we also committed to a year-long process of figuring out, of designing a new system of public safety with the public. And we're still committed to that. The truth is that with the current charter language, if we were to engage in a public dialogue, we would not be able to earnestly apply any recommendations that we get from the community with our current charter in place. And so we're still committed to drastically reimagining what our new public safety system looks like, but we are going to have to design that before we change the status quo.
And Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I also think this is consistent with that, and it's also consistent with the resolution that we passed recently, and it's also consistent with what you'll find in many other places. You'll notice with this new charter language, there isn't anything called the police department listed in it, and in fact, those things that were called the police department are gone. Certainly, there's a provision in here that would allow this council or future councils to maintain a division of law enforcement services. But I think what we need to do is have that possibility there and talk to people about what the future should look like. I think a lot of people can agree that there are essential services that are currently being provided by licensed peace officers, licensed by the state of Minnesota, and we need to have a very careful discussion about which of those services do we want to continue and which of those should continue to be maintained by state licensed peace officers in the state of Minnesota.
I'll call next on Steve Karnowski from AP.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just joined this, so forgive me if I missed it. But I'm hearing from, people on kind of both ends of the spectrum here that the whole process has been rushed, and that there aren't really enough specific ideas for how to proceed with this. And what's your response on that?
Councilmember Ellison.
And yeah, I don't mean to hog time, so my colleagues can also jump in. I would agree that George Floyd was not murdered on our ideal, maybe bureaucratic schedule. I agree that's how that went down. But at the end of the day, we have to contend with the fact that one of our employees murdered George Floyd at the intersection of 38th and Chicago, and that the community has requested that we make it possible to reimagine what public safety looks like in our city. It would be disingenuous for us to engage with the public about what a new public safety system could look like, knowing full well that we can't implement those things because of the charter provision, because of how the charter is currently written. And so we're changing the charter for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons is so that we can earnestly engage with the public, knowing that we are not lying to them when we say we're working with you to transform public safety.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, and thank you, Steve, for that question. So I think that it's important to name that we have committed to a community engagement process. And when we think about a community engagement process, that also includes developing the plan of community engagement itself. So that is the work that we are beginning the process I'm undertaking. That is what we have committed to, is a year-long process. I will also share that we are not starting from scratch. We are not starting with a completely blank slate. We have examples from all across the country, including here in Minneapolis, of models that can be operationalized or scaled in order to be able to actually have the population level impact that we would like to see. The model, again, we're not operating in the dark. There is a model, the public health approach to public safety, which treats violence like a disease that spreads, and it spreads interpersonally, it spreads intergenerationally, and there are evidence-based, research-based strategies on how to be able to disrupt that cycle of violence in communities and in the home. We have some of those strategies already being implemented, but they are not at the scale in which they need to be. We can work with alongside community to be able to more clearly define what are the kind of responses that folks would like, what are the kind of preventative measures do folks believe is most impactful in our communities, and how do we best disrupt and interrupt the violence as it is occurring in our community. We're not starting from scratch. We're not starting from a blank slate. We have a foundation on which we are building.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. I'm not hearing Councilmember Gordon. Maybe we'll go on to
my fault. I'm sorry about that. Thanks for facilitating. I just want to I really appreciate what Councilmember Cunningham said, and I think that is very helpful and very useful. I just also wanted to raise an interesting point, because what we're talking about with this charter isn't necessarily all the policies and what some department will be doing. This is the charter, this is our founding document. So we're talking about how it can be set up and structured, and we certainly have had an opportunity to see how something set up like this could work. All we need to do is look at the Public Works Department or the Fire Department, and we can see how it works when the council, working in cooperation with the mayor, representing the people that we represent, setting policy for a department, helping hire a head of a department to manage that department for us, can be effective and can work well. And that's what we're suggesting here, is we want to set up a structure that we know can work and can work well, even with a very large department like Public Works with a variety of different divisions, and it can be done effectively. And so we're actually going back to something I think that is tried and true, and not nearly so unusual, and I would suggest archaic, as what we have been having to work under for the past decades.
I'll just add my own comment briefly, that I think it is common when you're pursuing bold changes for people to say that you're moving too fast, and for people to demand absolute clarity and to try to imagine all of the ways that there might be a lack of clarity in something that hasn't been tried before. And so I just want to frame us in that we are trying something bold. It is going to take courage and creativity. I believe we are a city of courage and creativity, and I believe we're a city that has determined that the way we've been doing things does not work. I'll call next on Brant Williams from NPR. Brant, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. A couple different questions, but I'll try to keep it to one. The mayor has, I got a chance to hear a little bit of the mayor's response, and he's criticized this action as something that is a barrier to transparency as far as accountability. How do you respond to his criticism that this is a way to have 14 elected officials in charge of public safety, and that's an unwieldy spot to put any type of law enforcement or public safety or whatever you want to call it function under right now?
Thanks for that question. I'll call on Councilmember Ellison.
You know, I would say that the current structure has proven to be a failure. And people don't just want someone to point the finger at after the fact. They want to know that when they elect people to go to City Hall to affect change with the police department, that those people have a say in doing so. They don't just want someone to point the finger at when things have gone utterly awry, which I also watched the press conference, and that seemed to be what his definition of transparency was, that when things go utterly awry, people get to blame me. Well, people don't want just someone to blame, they want things to work. And the current system has not worked. In every other part of this city, the mayor has executive authority, not complete authority. And the council has legislative authority, except for the police. And so in this new department, the council will have legislative authority. The mayor will still have executive authority. But people have to feel confident that that when policies are written, that they can find them somewhere. That they are that when the council makes a writes a staff direction or an ordinance regulating the behavior of our new model of public safety, that those things are going to be followed, and that they have to be followed. And so I would say that this actually increases transparency. It increases accountability. It makes it so that people have more of a say in how they're kept safe in their city. And so it.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that
Yes.
point, Councilmember Ellison? You've probably heard from folks who've been calling for community control of the police for years now. Does this model allow for community control of police, or is this just the city council taking over something and adding another layer of bureaucracy to something that people want to have more control over?
Well, last time I checked, people do elect city council members. I think that's still true. And I would say that, like every other department in our city, the mayor's the executive, the council has legislative authority, and so this would give the council legislative authority. That's the clearest I could really answer the question you asked.
I'm gonna put myself in queue if I can, and answer that a little bit. I think there's a really the questions that they're raising are really important, and there are some state legislative barriers to having the kind of community oversight with teeth that people really desire. So there are multiple structures that have to be changed. But what this does is it does put the division where any kind of policing function would exist in the new department under a department head who's accountable to the council in the ways that and that can create some structures of accountability within that. I'll say that right now, the structures of accountability are very limited, and we're actually being sued over a lack of transparency from the police department and over ways that our accountability is lacking. So this is not something that's working. And even I'll just note, for example, that NPR News had a story yesterday that outlined a program that had gotten funding from a private source and then has lost funding from a private source. And there's never been a public conversation of that program in a way that people could ask questions and decide if it was even a positive programmatic direction to go. And I'll admit that I have some skepticism about algorithm-based predictive performance measures, and would want to get my questions answered about that before the city committed money. And I think that as a representative of my ward, that's something that people want to have happen. So I think we do need to push for more community involvement, and I think we do need to push for more civilian oversight. I think people have been clear about that. We are fixing, I think, in the charter what we can fix now, and we are creating space for such a structure to exist, especially as some of the other structures begin to change over time. I'll call on Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. To this question of sort of what the community role in our system. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that by us making a motion to send the question to the voters, it's, I would say, the prime way that we are having the community have power and say in that future. And so I don't remember when the last time the city council did anything like this before, where we brought forward a charter question before the voters to say, what would you like the future of safety to be like in the city? So I would, I guess I would just highlight the fact that that motion itself speaks volume about the type of power and voice that we want every Minneapolis resident to have in constructing this this new system. Secondly, I'll just speak for myself here in that I'm very, very interested in building an ordinance with my colleagues that codifies or that secures a community-led commission to play a role in the appointment process for the future director of the charter department. So I think that a lot of the values that we've heard our community express over the last 10 to 20 years on policing issues can be baked into those ordinances that can then support the future work of our new department and potentially any division within there that might have law enforcement services. Thank you.
Thank you, and Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I was wanted to respond a little bit, I think, to the original question, if I'm recalling it correctly. And unfortunately, I didn't hear the mayor's comments that he made recently, and I'm a little disappointed that it sounds like he's come out in such direct opposition to this. I would appreciate an opportunity to hear his concerns and discuss them. This idea of 14 bosses, this came up last time we attempted a charter amendment like this as well. I think this, right now, this charter amendment is written rather differently. The person who's in charge of the licensed peace officers, should we choose to have that division, will report to one person, and that's the department head, the head of the department. I'll also note that we have a situation like this with other department heads too, and I think that councils can be pretty nimble and pretty good in terms of realizing their role and their place in it. We have a director of emergency management who sometimes has to make split-second decisions and does so just fine based on policy set by the council. We have a public works director who has to activate lots of things in response to a snow emergency that wasn't anticipated, and they do so under the policy and the guidance that's set by the council. Or others might be asking for is a strong mayor system where we have a city manager and the council doesn't really isn't involved, which to me then sets that further away from direct democracy. And I actually think including more people and more voices, you usually end up with a better policy in the end. So I hope that addresses some of those concerns. And at this point, just generally, I think I would advocate that people keep their minds open and their hearts open to listen to one another so that we can actually hear the different perspectives and the different viewpoints, and so we can get closer to finding that consensus that I think everybody wants. And I think that we'll be surprised that the mayor's idea and even the police chief's ideas about how to transform and recreate our public safety aren't that different from the general understanding of the entire city and even where the council is. So I'm hoping that we can work together. I know we were united as a council in the resolution, and I think the mayor actually is in agreement with a lot of that, and I look forward to working with the mayor and working with the chief as we all move forward, hopefully advocating for this charter change that is so critically important to the city.
Thank you. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you. I just want to point out that our current mechanisms for accountability, we have two main ones. The first is approval of the appointment of the police chief and the budget. Because of the fact that there is no real authority over the police department outside of those two mechanisms, it has created a dynamic that whenever we engage with the police chief, the department head of that department, to hold him accountable for how his employees and department operates, we as a council are seen as picking on him, which is unmatched with any other department in the city, despite the fact that the police department is the only employee, or the police department is made up is the only department made up of employees who are authorized to carry guns and kill our residents. So what we need actually is to be able to address the fact that this current dynamic limits transparent conversations about decisions that are being made, how they are being made, and what they will look like when they're actually implemented. For us to be able to keep our residents safest, we need to be able to actually do the work in an open, democratic way, which currently that is not the case.
Thank you. I'll call next on Eric Chalou from KSTP. Eric, are you on the line? I'm not hearing Eric. Next is Rob Olson from Fox 9.
My question, coming from, and pardon me if this was covered before, I was at the Chief's news conference, so I joined this a little late, but he raised the question of what does this mean for Chief Arredondo, who's been very popular with the public, and does this mean he is eliminated? Does this mean he is demoted? What happens to him under these scenarios?
Councilmember Gordon and then Cunningham.
Absolutely nothing. His status remains the same right now. We're moving something forward to committee and forward to the Charter Commission for review. So I think that's his status remains changed. This isn't about Chief Arredondo. And it's going to be a long journey forward to see if there are any changes or not.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you. In addition to what Councilmember Gordon just said, I will also say from my perspective that Chief Arredondo is absolutely the right leader to be able to be bringing the law enforcement perspective of the work that is ahead of us. His potential vision for being able to create or co-create a new division of law enforcement services. Like there's a space there for him to really be able to operationalize the vision that he has brought forward and that folks want to see come true in terms of law enforcement. Again, law enforcement is one perspective, it's one component of a comprehensive approach to public safety. So what we're doing in this conversation is that we are including the other aspects of it as well. That does not diminish Chief Arredondo in doing so.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison, and then I'll put myself in queue.
I would agree with what my colleague said, and I would also add that in the mayor's press conference, he sort of personalized some things, and he said, if this is about me, then we could take that up next election. And I think that really punctuated the point that this isn't about him, and this isn't about the chief, and it's not really about the council either. It's about the fact that we have a system of public safety that in a lot of ways fails to keep people safe, that is burdened by a lack of transparency and a lack of consequences. And so we need to design policy that isn't personality based, but that is structural and that can lead us down a path that is sustainable long term. Because it won't always be me in this seat. It won't always be the mayor in his seat. It won't always be Chief Rondo. And for that matter, we've got a great administration broadly. Councilmember Cunningham and I, even despite our calls for police accountability, maintain a great relationship with the 4th Precinct Inspector, for example. But we can't create policy that is personality based. And so we're looking to create a system that we think is going to work long into the future.
Thank you. And I'll just add to that. When I was running for this office, before I knew who the mayor and the chief would be, it was a common talking point for me to say, we can't keep leaving this to the mayor and the chief. Looking back, many mayors and many chiefs, this is a relationship and a fulcrum of responsibility that has set people up for failure. And so my hope is that what this does for Chief Arredondo is it sets up a job that is created in a way that is free of some of the structural barriers and some of the accrued challenges of a department that is beyond reform, and that no leader, no matter how much we respect that leader, has a real shot at changing for all the structural reasons we've been talking about over the last month. My hope is that by making this charter change, we can actually create a job that a really first-class leader can go in and succeed in. And I think that that's something that we haven't had. I think it's something that structurally we don't have, and it's one of the reasons that we need to make this structural change to our charter. Next I have, sorry, let me just go back and just check if Eric from KSTP is on now, if you're having tech problems. Otherwise, I'll call on Chris Haratsky from KARE 11. Chris, are you still on?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for taking my question. I'm very grateful, and I apologize if I'm reiterating some of the questions that we've already heard, but I was just hoping for maybe a little more clarity because I did just listen to the mayor's press conference in its totality. And again, I'll just reiterate for maybe folks who didn't hear what the mayor had said. He said he agrees that asking voters to vote on something like this is appropriate, but he says that you're asking voters to vote on something without details and without precision. And it was in his estimation that it is precision and specifics that will address certain problems in the police department. His question specifically, will we still have police? And you just kind of covered this. Will Chief Arredondo still run the police after his journey to becoming chief? And will that law enforcement area be held accountable by 14 people instead of 1 or 2? So I guess in summation, he feels like the voters will be voting on something that hasn't been hashed out yet. So I was wondering if you could answer some of those specific questions so that the public and the mayor, I guess,
I think it's pretty
would know the
simple.
answers.
Thank you for that question. So I'll just say there are things that are intentionally not hashed out yet. Because we actually think that it's very important for the community to make these decisions together. Ultimately, the police chief and every single other city employee is accountable to 430,000 Minneapolis residents, not to one person and not to 14 people. We do create a clarified structure so that there is one supervisor for the director of the new division within that department, and that is the department head of the Department of Community Safety. We think that that is a clear structure for day-to-day communication. We think that that allows us for ways through ordinance to create clear lines of communication and direction for both the use of executive power and legislative power. And we think that we can create a structure that makes a lot of sense. I don't think any of us can speak to the future. It would be anytime a job is changing, and we are certainly, regardless of this charter change, having a broad public debate about changing what the Minneapolis Police Department looks like. It will take both the city moving those changes and the employee in question, in this case Chief Arredondo, to decide together that it's a good fit for both of them. And I am certainly respectful of Chief Arredondo's leadership, and I want to see him given every opportunity to contribute to that vision. But it is something that he will have to decide as well as us. And I think that that is important for everybody to keep in mind, that this is not about one person, and we have to build a structure that will work and that will set the next person up for success, regardless of who it is. I'll call on Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you. So I'll just say that I have heard overwhelmingly from my constituents in North Minneapolis that they want to see some sort of structural and systemic change to the police department, even if we don't know necessarily what the specifics are of what the various other strategies. The work that is ahead of us is to dig into those specifics with community. We would be setting up the entire process to fail by going through this process, working alongside community, building these new systems, and then not being able to operationalize that because we don't have an umbrella under which it can live. Regardless if folks think that we should not change anything about the police department, or they think we should completely abolish the police department, the reality is that having a department that essentially serves, as one of my colleagues explained to me, as a container in which law enforcement and that entire comprehensive approach to public safety fits underneath that umbrella. Ultimately, we are not able to operationalize what our residents are asking for under the current structure. It would not be appropriate for us to bring forward a fully baked plan without having done the engagement. And it also is not genuine for us to go out into the community saying we are going to do the major systemic changes that you have asked for, and then not be able to implement it because we have the barrier of the charter as it currently reads. This is giving us space to be able to do the thoughtful and intentional work of building new systems. Is creating the space for us to do so.
You're muted, sir.
I almost got through this whole thing without doing that. I will call on Councilmember Ellison, and then I think we've gotten through the questions that people have signed up to ask. So afterwards, I'll probably see if there's one last question, and then we'll wrap this up. Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. Chris, I appreciate the question. I'm going to be frank. I think that there's not a lack of clarity here. I think the council's been clear. I think that the mayor, if I'm being frank, has decided that it is in his best interest to generate a lack of clarity. But the truth is that he understands how the charter works and how the charter is written, and that a lot of the details of any department can be written in ordinance and frequently are. And so we have an opportunity to change the charter, and we are not missing any opportunity to refine this department in ordinance into the future as we go about our public engagement. You asked about this quote unquote, this colloquialism of 14 bosses. The truth is that the city structure for every other department, with the exception of the current police department, is the mayor as the executive and the council as the legislative. This would give council legislative authority. And so that's very clear. And I'll break down, I think, what the ultimate debate that we're having here. If you imagine that the police department is a bottle, if it's only labeled police, only police can go in it. If we label it public safety, then sure, the police can occupy that space, but a lot of other things can go into it. And that's really the whole of the conversation that we're having here. The mayor knows very well that if we went out to do public engagement, that the public would then be very frustrated to learn that they had to wait yet another year for transformative change to public safety while we sort out the charter as we are now. I think that the transparent thing to do, the earnest and responsible thing to do, is to remove the charter as a barrier now and then proceed into the future with the public on this road to transformation of our public safety system.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. If anybody's got one, you can just unmute yourself and ask.
Hi there, this is Susan Elizabeth at WCCO.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, one quick last question here to wrap this up. I think what people are craving here is a tangible model. I know we've looked at Camden, New Jersey. Is there anywhere specific you guys are looking at? Is there anything you can give them to kind of paint a picture of what this would look like?
I'll call on Councilmember Cunningham first for that.
Yes, thank you for that question. So one aspect of this is, again, thinking about the comprehensive approach. So what you're talking about very specifically is around restructuring the police department. What we're talking about here is completely reimagining public safety. And we want to do so in a way that roots the public health approach. We have models from literally all over the world that we can build on. So I gave the example of Vail, Colorado, that has, they send mental health experts to mental health crises rather than armed officers. We have other cities use mediation services for neighbor disputes rather than armed officers. In Chicago and Baltimore, they have implemented a particular program called Cure Violence, which is a step even beyond what we're doing here with our group violence intervention by having teams of community members who have come out of a life of crime and violence, who have reformed their lives, gotten on the right path, and now are on the ground out in communities interacting with and disrupting violence as it is bubbling up. So they're preventing it from even happening in the first place. And they're doing that unarmed. And so we have lots of examples. I recommend for folks to please take a look at these various models. The city of Milwaukee has an Office of Violence Prevention that's doing amazing work. Louisville, Kentucky has an Office of Violence Prevention that's doing really great work. Here in Minneapolis, we have the Office of Violence Prevention, which is doing amazing work. It's just not at scale so that we're seeing the population level impact that our residents want to see. And so when we talk about reimagining public safety, we're thinking about all of those levers so that we can actually have sustainable safety and peace in our communities. We're not starting from scratch. We're not starting from a blank slate. We have models in all of those various cities and more for us to be able to continue building on the work that we've already started here. The violence prevention work, just so folks understand, has been in some way operating in the city of Minneapolis since 2006. So while we operationalized the Office of Violence Prevention in 2018, the work had started long before then. The expertise of the public health approach to public safety started long before then. And so we have the opportunity to build on that foundation as well as look to the various other cities, as I gave an example of.
Councilmember Ellison and then Councilmember Khanna.
I can't say it too much better than my colleague, Councilmember Cunningham, and so I'll keep my comments brief. In short, I'll say that, to reiterate what Councilmember Cunningham said, we're not starting from a blank slate. I think, Camden's one model. It's not the full direction that we're looking to go in, but it certainly offers some insights into how we can move in this direction. As Councilmember Cunningham reiterated, we have programs like the Office of Violence Prevention, like COPE at the county that we partner with here at the city, that we can build on. But I also think that it's important to mention that what we're talking about and what we're hearing from a lot of our constituents, obviously not all, but from a lot of our constituents, is that they're not afraid to be innovative in this way, and that we have an opportunity to really do something in Minneapolis that hasn't been done before. And that if we engage the public, if we're smart about about how we engage the public and then design and implement these programs, we're actually going to make people safer. Right now, we start with response. That's it. We start with response. What Councilmember Cunningham is talking about is starting from a place of prevention and then moving into response. I think that'll keep Minneapolis residents safer. I also want to remind folks that as of right now, not $1 has been defunded from the police department. Not one tool has been taken from the police, with the exception of the state ban on chokeholds and restrictions on crowd control. And so our current public safety system is operating at full capacity, and what we're seeing right now is the best it can do. And so we want to create a system that keeps people safer, and I think that that's what we're headed towards.
Councilmember Khanna.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. I'll just remind the journalists to go back to the charter language. It's clearly we have a department director there, as well as the potential to create a smaller division that provides law enforcement services. Overall, we are talking about a deeply engaging our community to come up with the specifics of what that department will have and how it will serve community. So right now, those models are being built by neighbors on the ground, block by block, as a response to the destruction of our city that we witnessed. That was part of some of the impacts of the George Floyd murder. And so I want to reiterate, like it's been said already, that we have a strong body of work at the city of Minneapolis, recognizing public safety as a public health issue or matter. And that work has steadily grown over time. I anticipate that work will double down on its efforts as we get ready to put together this new department. And the language that we approved today does have an implementation date of May 1st of next year. And so that really coincides nicely with the Truth and Reconciliation community engagement process that we want to begin and has already begun in some ways in many of our neighborhood blocks, where leaders and neighbors are getting together once or twice a week to decide how do people show up for each other in this moment when perhaps they don't feel like policing is the right solution. So please do take a look at some of those neighborhood organizations that are happening at that block by block level. Many of them are organizing on texting strings and communicate each night. They have patrols that go out every night. And then also look at the work that the city has funded in the past relating to public health to address violence prevention and violence interruption, because I think that's fertile ground to help you identify or anticipate some of the work that will be coming out of this new department.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, and I will be quick. I just wanted to give a couple more specific examples. So we actually in Minneapolis, with the pockets of work that has been underway, we've actually created 2 national models ourselves locally. But I do want to also just point to the Truth and Reconciliation. Like even that, we're not starting from scratch. Like we have examples from Native communities of work that they've done, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation process in post-apartheid South Africa. So we have even examples for that, but locally we have 2 models that have now been nationally recognized. The first is a Pathways program. It's an early intervention program. What the city attorney discovered is that folks who were first-time gun offenders carrying a weapon without a permit were disproportionately likely to go on to be victims or perpetrators of gun violence. So what this is an intervention, an early intervention to be able to help prevent the violence further down the road. The recidivism rate is astronomically lower. I'm sorry I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm sure we could get that for you, than if folks were not involved in that and on the national level. We also have the Blueprint Approved Institute in the Office of Violence Prevention, which actually helps build capacity, organizational capacity to those organic groups that pop up well, I speak to North Minneapolis, but throughout the city, who are doing the violence prevention work, whether that's basketball groups that like infuse violence prevention within what they're doing, that actually helps those groups be able to function more as an organization and be more competitive during the grant process so that they can grow and scale the impact that they're looking to make. So we have lots of good examples of what we're doing, and these are all sorts of ideas that we're going to be bringing to the community for feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the last word briefly. There is no city in the United States where I would take their public safety approach and just drop it into Minneapolis and consider it good enough. I believe that we can do better than anybody has previously done. I believe that 10 years from now, everybody will be looking to Minneapolis and looking to emulate the Minneapolis model. I think that that is the task that we are called to do. I don't think we chose this task. I don't think we would have chosen this task. I think we have seen compounding tragedies resulting from our failures of the past that lead us to a place where we are now in the world spotlight. Everybody's watching us and everybody wants to know what we're going to do. And we have an opportunity to change the course of public safety in this country. I believe we are called to do that. I believe we are capable of doing that. I believe there is no better city to take up this charge. And the path that we're going to chart will steal the best ideas from everywhere and combine them in a way that is uniquely appropriate to our city. And we will work to make absolutely everybody feel safe. Thank you, everybody, for coming.